by Jane Austen. Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever and rich, with a comfortable home and happy disposition, seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence, and had lived nearly 21 years in the world with very little to distress or vex her. She was the youngest of the 2 daughters of a most affectionate, indulgent father, and had, in consequence of her sister's marriage, been mistress of his house from a very early period. Her mother had died too long ago for her to have more than an indistinct remembrance of her caresses, and her place had been supplied by an excellent woman as governess. 16 years had Miss Taylor been in Mr. Woodhouse's family, less as a governess than a friend, very fond of both daughters, but particularly of Emma. Between them it was more the intimacy of sisters. Even before Miss Taylor had ceased to hold the nominal office of governess, the mildness of her temper had hardly allowed her to impose any restraint, and the shadow of authority being now long passed away, they had been living together as friend and friend, very mutually attached, and Emma doing just what she liked, highly esteeming Miss Taylor's judgment, but directed chiefly by her own. Sorrow came, a gentle sorrow, but not at all in the shape of any disagreeable consciousness. Miss Taylor married. It was on the wedding day of this beloved friend that Emma first sat in mournful thought of any continuance. The wedding over, and the bride people gone, her father and herself were left to dine together, with no prospect of a third to cheer a long evening. Her father composed himself to sleep after dinner, as usual, and she had then only to sit and think of what she had lost. How was she to bear the change? It was true that her friend was going only half a mile from them, but Emma was aware that great must be the difference between a Mrs. Weston only half a mile from them and a Miss Taylor in the house. Her sister, Isabella, being settled in London, was much beyond her daily reach, and many a long October and November evening must be struggled through at Hartfield before Christmas brought the next visit from Isabella and her husband and their little children to fill the house and give her pleasant society again. Highbury, the large and populous Surrey village to which Hartfield, in spite of its separate lawn and shrubberies and name, did really belong, afforded her many acquaintances, but not one among them who could be accepted in lieu of Miss Taylor, even for half a day. It was a melancholy change, and Emma could not but sigh over it and wish for impossible things, till her father awoke and made it necessary to be cheerful. The backgammon table was placed, but a visitor immediately afterwards walked in and made it unnecessary. Mr. Knightley, a sensible man about 7 or 38, was not only a very old and intimate friend of the family, but particularly connected with it as the elder brother of Isabella's husband, John. He lived about a mile from Highbury and was always welcome, and at this time more welcome than usual, as coming directly from their mutual connections in London. He had walked up to Hartfield to say that all were well in Brunswick Square. Mr. Woodhouse gratefully observed, "It is very kind of you, Mr. Knightley, to come out at this late hour to call upon us. I'm afraid you must have had a shocking walk." "Not at all, sir. It is a beautiful moonlit night, and so mild that I must draw back from your great fire. By the by, I have not wished you joy, being pretty well aware of what sort of joy you must both be feeling. I've been in no hurry with my congratulations, but I hope it all went off tolerably well. How did you all behave? Who cried most?" "Ah, poor Miss Taylor, 'tis a sad business." "Poor Mr. and Miss Woodhouse, if you please, but I cannot possibly say poor Miss Taylor. At any rate, it must be better for her to have only one to please rather than 2. "Especially when one of those is such a fanciful, troublesome creature," said Emma playfully. "That is what you have in your head, I know, and what you would certainly say if father were not by." "Oh, I believe it is very true, my dear, indeed. Oh," said Mr. Woodhouse with a sigh. "I'm afraid I'm sometimes very fanciful and troublesome." "My dearest papa, you do not think I could mean you, or suppose Mr. Knightley to mean you? What a horrible idea! Oh, no, I meant only myself. Mr. Knightley loves to find fault with me, you know, in a joke. It's all a joke. We always say what we like to one another." Mr. Knightley, in fact, was one of the few people who could see faults in Emma Woodhouse, and the only one who ever told her of them. "Well," said Emma, "you want to hear about the wedding, and I shall be happy to tell you, for we all behaved charmingly. And you have forgotten one matter of joy to me, a very considerable one, that I made the match myself. I made the match 4 years ago, and to have it take place and be proved in the right when so many people said Mr. Weston would never marry again may comfort me for anything." Her father fondly replied, "Ah, my dear, I wish you would not make matches and foretell things, for whatever you say always comes to pass. Pray do not make any more matches." "Only one more, Papa, only for Mr. Elton. Poor Mr. Elton, I must look about for a wife for him. I thought when he was joining their hands today he looked so very much as if he would like to have the same kind office done for him." "Mr. Elton is a very pretty young man, to be sure, but if you want to show him any attention, my dear, ask him to come and dine with us some day. That will be a much better thing. I dare say Mr. Knightley will be so kind as to meet him." "With a great deal of pleasure, sir," said Mr. Knightley, laughing, "and I agree with you entirely that it will be a much better thing. Invite him to dinner, Emma, and help him to the best of the fish and the chicken, but leave him to choose his own wife." Mr. Woodhouse was fond of society in his own way. He liked very much to have his friends come and see him. Real, long-standing regard brought the Westons and Mr. Knightley. As for Mr. Elton, the privilege of exchanging a vacant evening of his own blank solitude for the elegancies and society of Mr. Woodhouse's drawing-room was in no danger of being thrown away. After these came a second set, among the most come-at-able of whom were Mrs. and Miss Bates and Mrs. Goddard, 3 ladies almost always at the service of an invitation from Hartfield. Mrs. Bates, the widow of a former vicar of Highbury, lived with her single daughter and was considered with all the regard and respect which a harmless old lady can excite. Her daughter enjoyed a most uncommon degree of popularity for a woman neither young, handsome, rich, nor married. Mrs. Goddard was the mistress of a school, a real, honest, old-fashioned boarding school, where a reasonable quantity of accomplishments were sold at a reasonable price. Mrs. Goddard's school was in high repute, and very deservedly. These were the ladies whom Emma found herself very frequently able to collect, and happy was she for her father's sake. One morning, a note was brought from Mrs. Goddard, requesting to be allowed to bring a Miss Smith with her when next she visited, a most welcome request, for Miss Smith was a girl of 17 whom Emma knew very well by sight and had long felt an interest in on account of her beauty. Harriet Smith was the natural daughter of somebody. Somebody had placed her several years back at Mrs. Goddard's school, and somebody had lately raised her from the condition of scholar to that of parlour boarder. That was all that was generally known of her history. She was a very pretty girl, short, plump and fair, with a fine bloom, blue eyes, light hair, regular features, and a look of great sweetness. And at that first meeting Emma was as much pleased with her manners as her person, and quite determined to continue the acquaintance. Harriet Smith's intimacy at Hartfield was soon a settled thing. Quick and decided in her ways, Emma lost no time in encouraging her to come very often, and as their acquaintance increased, so did their satisfaction in each other. Harriet certainly was not clever, but she had a sweet, docile, grateful disposition, and was totally free from conceit, only desiring to be guided by anyone she looked up to. Mrs. Goddard and the teachers and the girls and the affairs of the school in general formed naturally a great part of her conversation, and but for her acquaintance with the Martins of Abbey Mill Farm, it must have been the whole. But the Martins occupied her thoughts a good deal. She had spent 2 very happy months with them, and now loved to talk of the pleasures of her visit and describe the many comforts and wonders of the place. Emma particularly led Harriet to talk more of Mr. Robert Martin, and there was evidently no dislike to it. Harriet was very ready to dwell a good deal upon his being so very good-humoured and obliging. They met Mr. Martin as they were walking on the Donwell Road one day. He was on foot, and after looking very respectfully at Emma, looked with most unfeigned satisfaction at her companion. Emma was not sorry to have such an opportunity of survey, and walking a few yards forwards while they talked together soon made her quick eye sufficiently acquainted with Mr. Robert Martin. They remained but a few minutes together, and Harriet then came running to her with a smiling face and in a flutter of spirits.
"Well, Miss Woodhouse, is he like what you expected? What do you think of him? Do you think him so very plain?"
"He is very plain, undoubtedly, remarkably plain, but that is nothing compared with his entire want of gentility."
"To be sure," said Harriet, in a mortified voice, "he is not so genteel as a real gentleman."
"I think, Harriet, since your acquaintance with us, you have been repeatedly in the company of some such very real gentleman that you must yourself be struck with the difference in Mr. Martin. At Hartfield you have had very good specimens of well-educated, well-bred men. I should be surprised if, after seeing them, you could be in the company with Mr. Martin again without perceiving him to be a very inferior creature." Mr. Elton was the very person fixed on by Emma for driving the young farmer out of Harriet's head. She thought it would be an excellent match. She had already satisfied herself that he thought Harriet a beautiful girl, which she trusted was foundation enough on his side, and on Harriet's there could be little doubt that the idea of being preferred by him would have all the usual weight and efficacy. And he was really a very pleasing young man whom any woman not fastidious might like. Very soon, circumstances produced a fresh occasion for Emma's services towards her friend. Harriet had been at Hartfield, as usual, soon after breakfast, and after a time had gone home to dinner. She returned, with an agitated, hurried look, announcing something extraordinary to have happened. She had heard, as soon as she got back to Mrs. Goddard's, that Mr. Martin had been there an hour before and had left a little parcel for her from one of his sisters and gone away, and on opening this parcel she had actually found, besides the 2 songs which she had lent Elizabeth Martin to copy, a letter to herself. And this letter was from him, from Mr. Martin, and contained a direct proposal of marriage.
"Will you read the letter?" cried Harriet. "Pray do. I'd rather you would."
Emma read, and was surprised. The style of the letter was much above her expectation. She paused over it while Harriet stood anxiously watching for her opinion, and was at last forced to add,
"Is it a good letter?"
"Yes, indeed, a very good letter," replied Emma, rather slowly. "A better written letter, Harriet, than I had expected."
"Well," said Harriet. "Well, and, what shall I do?"
"You must answer it, of course, and speedily."
"Yes, but what shall I say? Dear Miss Woodhouse, do advise me."
"Oh, no, no. The letter had much better be all your own. Expressions of gratitude and concern for the pain you are inflicting will present themselves unbidden to your mind."
"You think I ought to refuse him, then?" said Harriet, looking down.
"Ought to refuse him? My dear Harriet, what do you mean? Are you in any doubt as to that?" Harriet was silent. Emma continued. "You mean to return a favourable answer, I collect."
"Oh, no, I do not. That is, I do not mean... What shall I do? What would you advise me to do? Oh, pray, dear Miss Woodhouse, tell me what I ought to do."
"I shall not give you any advice, Harriet. I will have nothing to do with it."
"Miss Woodhouse, as you will not give me your opinion, I must do as well as I can by myself, and I have now quite determined and really almost made up my mind to refuse Mr. Martin. Do you think I'm right?"
"Perfectly. Perfectly right, my dearest Harriet. You are doing just what you ought." "Dear Harriet, I give myself joy of this. It would have grieved me to lose your acquaintance, which must have been the consequence of your marrying Mr. Martin. I could not have visited Mrs. Robert Martin of Abbey Mill Farm. Now I am secure of you for ever."
"You could not have visited me?" "No, to be sure, you could not. But I never thought of that before. That would have been too dreadful. What an escape! Dear Miss Woodhouse, I would not give up the pleasure and honour of being intimate with you for anything in the world. I am quite determined to refuse him. But how shall I do? What shall I say?"
Emma assured her there would be no difficulty in the answer and advised its being written directly, which Harriet agreed to in the hope of Emma's assistance. and though Emma continued to protest against any assistance being wanted, it was in fact given in the formation of every sentence. Harriet slept at Hartfield that night. For some weeks past she had been spending more than half her time there, and gradually getting to have a bedroom appropriated to herself. She was obliged to go the next morning for an hour or two to Mrs. Goddard's, but it was settled that she should return to Hartfield to make a regular visit of some days. While she was gone, Mr. Knightley called and sat some time with Mr. Woodhouse and Emma, till Mr. Woodhouse, who had previously made up his mind to walk out, was persuaded by his daughter not to defer it. Mr. Woodhouse set off. Mr. Knightley sat down again, seemingly inclined for more chat. He began speaking of Harriet, and speaking of her with more voluntary praise than Emma had ever heard before. He presently added, with a smile, "I must tell you that I have good reason to believe your little friend will soon hear of something to her advantage."
"Indeed? How so? Of what sort?"
"A very serious sort, I assure you," still smiling.
"Very serious? I can think of but one thing. Who is in love with her? Who makes you their confidant?"
Emma was more than half in hopes of Mr. Elton's having dropped a hint. "I have reason to think," he replied, "that Harriet Smith will soon have an offer of marriage, and from a most unexceptionable quarter. Robert Martin is the man. Her visit to Abbey Mill this summer seems to have done his business. He is desperately in love and means to marry her."
"He is very obliging," said Emma. "But is he sure that Harriet means to marry him?"
"He means to make her an offer, then. Will that do?"
"Come," said Emma. "I will tell you something in return for what you have told me. He did speak yesterday, that is, he wrote, and was refused."
"Then she is a greater simpleton than I ever believed her. What is the foolish girl about?"
"Oh, to be sure," cried Emma. "It is always incomprehensible to a man that a woman should ever refuse an offer of marriage. A man always imagines a woman to be ready for anybody who asks her."
"Nonsense. A man does not imagine any such thing. But what is the meaning of this? Harriet Smith refuse Robert Martin? What are Harriet Smith's claims, either of birth, nature, or education, to any connection higher than Robert Martin? She is the natural daughter of nobody knows whom, with probably no settled provision at all, and certainly no respectable relations. She is known only as a parlour boarder at a common school."
"I cannot help wondering at your knowing so little of Harriet as to say any such thing," replied Emma. "Mr. Martin may be the richest of the two, but he is undoubtedly her inferior as to rank in society. The sphere in which she moves is much above his. It would be a degradation."
"A degradation to illegitimacy and ignorance to be married to a respectable, intelligent gentleman farmer? Good morning to you," said he, rising and walking off abruptly. Mr. Knightley was so much displeased that it was longer than usual before he came to Hartfield again, and when they did meet, his grave looks showed Emma that she was not forgiven. She was sorry, but could not repent, and continued to encourage the friendship between her friend and Mr. Elton. Though now the middle of December, there had yet been no weather to prevent the young ladies from tolerably regular exercise. One morning, Emma had a charitable visit to pay a poor sick family who lived a little way out of Highbury. Harriet accompanied her. Their road to this detached cottage was down Vicarage Lane. About a quarter of a mile down the lane rose the vicarage, and there could be no possibility of the two friends passing it without a slackened pace and observing eyes. Emma's remark was, "There it is. There go you one of these days." Harriet had never in her life been inside the vicarage, and her curiosity to see it was so extreme that Emma could only class it as a proof of love. "I wish we could contrive it," said she, "but I cannot think of any tolerable pretence for going in. No servant that I want to inquire about of his housekeeper, no message from my father." She pondered, but could think of nothing. After a mutual silence of some minutes, Harriet thus began again. "I do so wonder, Miss Woodhouse, that you should not be married, or going to be married, so charming as you are." Emma laughed and replied, "My being charming, Harriet, is not quite enough to induce me to marry. I must find other people charming. one other person at least, and I am not only not going to be married at present, but have very little intention of ever marrying at all."
"But you will be an old maid, and that's so dreadful."
"Never mind, Harriet. I shall not be a poor old maid, and it is poverty only which makes celibacy contemptible to a generous public. A single woman with a very narrow income must be a ridiculous, disagreeable old maid, the proper sport of boys and girls, but a single woman of good fortune is always respectable." As they started on their return journey, who should they meet but Mr. Elton, whom they invited to accompany them as far as their routes coincided. Arriving within view of the vicarage pales once again, a sudden resolution of at least getting Harriet into the house made Emma find something very much amiss about her boot. She broke the lace off short and, dexterously throwing it into a ditch, was presently obliged to entreat the others to stop. "Part of my lace is gone. Mr. Elton, I must beg leave to stop at your house and ask your housekeeper for a bit of riband or string or anything just to keep my boot on." Mr. Elton looked all happiness at this proposition, and nothing could exceed his alertness and attention in conducting them into his house and endeavouring to make everything appear to advantage. The room they were taken into was the one he chiefly occupied. Behind it was another with which it immediately communicated. Emma passed into it with the housekeeper to receive her assistance. When she returned, her two friends were standing together at one of the windows. The scene had a most favourable aspect, and for half a minute Emma felt the glory of having schemed successfully. But it would not do. He had not come to the point. No romantic declaration had been forthcoming. Still, however, though everything had not been accomplished by her ingenious device, she could not but flatter herself that it must be leading them forward. Mr. Elton must now be left to himself. It was no longer in Emma's power to superintend his happiness or quicken his measures. The coming of her sister's family was so very near at hand that, first in anticipation and then in reality, it became henceforth her prime object of interest. Mr. and Mrs. John Knightley, from having been longer than usual absent from Surrey, were exciting, of course, rather more than the usual interest. Mrs. John Knightley, Emma's sister Isabella, was a pretty, elegant little woman, of gentle, quiet manners, and a disposition remarkably amiable and affectionate. Mr. John Knightley was a tall and very clever man, rising in his profession and respectable in his private character, but with reserved manners which prevented his being generally pleasing and capable of being sometimes out of humour. They had not been long in residence when Mr. Woodhouse, with a melancholy shake of the head and a sigh, called his elder daughter's attention to the sad change at Hartfield since she had been there last. "Ah, my dear," said he, "poor Miss Taylor, it is a grievous business." "Oh, yes, sir," cried she with ready sympathy. "How you must miss her. And dear Emma, too. What a dreadful loss to you both. I have been so grieved for you. Do you see her tolerably often?" Mr. Woodhouse hesitated. "Not nearly so often, my dear, as I could wish." "Oh, Papa!" exclaimed Emma. "We have missed seeing them but one entire day since they married. Either in the morning or evening of every day excepting one have we seen either Mr. Weston or Mrs. Weston, and generally both." "Where is the young man?" said John Knightley. Mr. Knightley referred to Mr. Weston's son. The issue of a marriage ended by the death of the boy's mother. The child had been adopted by the Churchills, the parents of Mr. Weston's first wife, and taken their name. "Has he been here?" "He's not been here yet," replied Emma. "There was a strong expectation of his coming soon after the marriage, but it ended in nothing." "But you should tell them of the letter, my dear," said her father. "He wrote a letter to Mrs. Weston to congratulate her, and a very proper, handsome letter it was. It was signed F.C. Weston Churchill. I remember that perfectly." "How very pleasing and proper of him," cried the good-hearted Mrs. John Knightley. "I have no doubt of his being a most amiable young man, but how sad it is that he should not live at home with his father. To give up one's child! I really never could think well of anybody who proposed such a thing to anybody else." "Nobody ever did think well of the Churchills, I fancy," observed Mr. John Knightley, coolly. "But Mr. Weston is rather an easy, cheerful-tempered man than a man of strong feelings. He depends, I suspect, much more upon what is called society for his comforts than upon family affection or anything that home affords." Emma could not like what bordered on a reflection on Mr. Weston, and had half a mind to take it up, but she struggled and let it pass. The elder Mr. Knightley was to dine with them, rather against the inclination of Mr. Woodhouse, who did not like that anyone should share with him in Isabella's first day. Emma's sense of right, however, had decided it, and besides the consideration of what was due to each brother, she had particular pleasure from the circumstance of the late disagreement between Mr. Knightley and herself in procuring him the proper invitation. She hoped they might now become friends again. She thought it was time to make up. The evening was quiet and conversable, as Mr. Woodhouse declined cards entirely for the sake of comfortable talk with his dear Isabella, and the little party made two natural divisions. On one side he and his daughter, on the other the two Mr. Knightleys, their subjects totally distinct, or very rarely mixing, and Emma only occasionally joining in one or the other. When giving her attention to her father and sister, she heard Isabella's kind inquiry after Jane Fairfax, Mrs. Bates's granddaughter, and Jane Fairfax, though no great favourite with her in general, she was at that moment very happy to assist in praising. "That sweet, amiable Jane Fairfax," said Mrs. John Knightley. "It is so long since I have seen her, except now and then for a moment accidentally in town. What happiness it must be to her good old grandmother and excellent aunt when she comes to visit them. I always regret excessively on dear Emma's account that she cannot be more at Highbury." Mr. Woodhouse agreed to it all, but added, "Our little friend Harriet Smith, however, is just such another pretty kind of young person. You will like Harriet. Emma could not have a better companion than Harriet." "I am most happy to hear it, but only Jane Fairfax one knows to be so very accomplished and superior, and exactly Emma's age." This topic was discussed very happily, and others succeeded of similar moment and passed away with similar harmony. There could hardly be a happier creature in the world than Mrs. John Knightley, in this short visit to Hartfield, going about every morning among her old acquaintance with her 5 children, and talking over what she had done every evening with her father and sister. In general, their evenings were less engaged with friends than their mornings, but one complete dinner engagement, and out of the house, too, there was no avoiding, though at Christmas. Mr. Weston would take no denial. They must all dine at his house, Randall's. Harriet Smith, Mr. Elton, and Mr. Knightley were the only other persons invited. The hours were to be early, as well as the numbers few, Mr. Woodhouse's habits and inclinations being consulted in everything. The evening before this great event, for it was a very great event that Mr. Woodhouse should dine out on the 24th of December, had been spent by Harriet at Hartfield, and she had gone home much indisposed with a cold. Emma called on her the next day, and found her doom already signed with regard to Randall's. She was very feverish, and had a bad sore throat. Emma sat with her as long as she could, and tried to raise her spirits by representing how much Mr. Elton would be depressed when he knew her state, and left her at last tolerably comfortable in the sweet dependence of their all missing her very much. She had not advanced many yards from Mrs. Goddard's door when she was met by Mr. Elton himself. Emma explained the nature of her friend's complaint. A throat very much inflamed, with a great deal of heat about her and a quick, low pulse. Mr. Elton looked all alarm as he exclaimed, "A sore throat? I hope not infectious. I hope not of a putrid, infectious sort. Indeed, you should take care of yourself as well as your friend. Let me entreat you to run no risks." Soon afterwards, Mr. Elton quitted her, and Emma could not but do him the justice of feeling that there was a great deal of sentiment in his manner of naming Harriet at parting, in the tone of his voice while assuring her that he should call at Mrs. Goddard's for news of her fair friend, the last thing before he prepared for the happiness of meeting her again, when he hoped to be able to give a better report. And he sighed and smiled himself off in a way that left the balance of approbation much in his favour. Mr. Woodhouse had so completely made up his mind to the visit that, in spite of the increasing coldness, he seemed to have no idea of shrinking from it, and set forward at last most punctually with his eldest daughter in his own carriage, with less apparent consciousness of the weather than either of the others. The cold, however, was severe, and by the time the second carriage was in motion, a few flakes of snow were finding their way down, and the sky had the appearance of being so overcharged as to want only a milder air to produce a very white world in a very short time. The second carriage contained Emma and her brother-in-law. Emma soon saw that her companion was not in the happiest humour. The preparing and the going abroad in such weather, with the sacrifice of time with his children after dinner, were evils, were disagreeables at least, which Mr. John Knightley did not by any means like. He anticipated nothing in the visit that could be at all worth the purchase, and the whole of their drive to the vicarage was spent by him in expressing his discontent. At the vicarage the carriage turned, the step was let down, and Mr. Elton, spruce, black and smiling, was with them instantly. "Christmas weather," he observed, "quite seasonable, and extremely fortunate we may think ourselves that it did not begin yesterday and prevent this day's party. We are sure of excellent fires," continued he, "and everything in the greatest comfort. Charming people, Mr. and Mrs. Weston. It will be a small party, but where small parties are select, they are perhaps the most agreeable of any, though Mr. Knightley, perhaps from being used to the large parties of London, may not quite enter into our feelings." "I know nothing of the large parties of London, sir. I never dine with anybody. My first enjoyment will be to find myself safe at Hartfield again." Some change of countenance was necessary for each gentleman as they walked into Mrs. Weston's drawing-room. Mr. Elton must compose his joyous looks, and Mr. John Knightley disperse his ill humour. Mr. Elton must smile less, and Mr. John Knightley more, to fit them for the place. Emma only might be as nature prompted, and show herself just as happy as she was. As she entered, she heard enough to know that Mr. Weston was giving some information about his son, Frank Churchill. She heard the words "my son" and "Frank" and "my son" repeated several times over, and from a few other half-syllables very much suspected that he was announcing an early visit from his son. Now, it so happened that there was something in the name, in the idea of Mr. Frank Churchill, which had always interested her. She had a great curiosity to see him. She had the comfort of thinking that the rest of the visit could not possibly pass without bringing forward the same information again, or the substance of it, from the open-hearted Mr. Weston. So it proved, for when happily seated by Mr. Weston at dinner, he made use of the very first interval in the cares of hospitality to say to her, "We want only 2 more to be just the right number. I should like to see 2 more here, your pretty little friend, Miss Smith, and my son. And then I should say we were quite complete. I believe you did not hear me telling the others in the drawing-room that we're expecting Frank. I had a letter from him this morning, and he will be with us within a fortnight. He's been wanting to come to us," continued Mr. Weston, "ever since September. Every letter has been full of it. Now I have no doubt of seeing him here about the 2nd week in January." "What a very great pleasure it will be to you, and Mrs. Weston is so anxious to be acquainted with him that she must be almost as happy as yourself." Emma liked the subject so well that she began upon it to Mrs. Weston, very soon after the ladies, closely followed by Mr. Woodhouse, had moved into the drawing-room, wishing her joy of the visit, yet observing that she knew the first meeting must be rather alarming. "My Emma," replied Mrs. Weston, smiling, "you must know that we are by no means so sure of seeing Mr. Frank Churchill, in my opinion, as his father thinks. It depends entirely upon his aunt's spirits and pleasure, in short, upon her temper. Mrs. Churchill rules at Enscombe, and is a very odd-tempered woman, and his coming now depends on her being willing to spare him." Mr. Woodhouse was soon ready for his tea, and when he had drunk it, he was quite ready to go home, and it was as much as his 3 companions could do to entertain away his notice of the lateness of the hour before the other gentlemen appeared. Mr. John Knightley came into the room from examining the weather, and opened on them all with the information of the ground being covered with snow, and of it still snowing fast with a strong drifting wind. Poor Mr. Woodhouse was silent from consternation, and his eldest daughter's alarm was equal to his own. The horror of being blocked up at Randall's while her children were at Hartfield was full in her imagination. The bell was rung, and the carriages spoken for. A few minutes more, and the carriages came, and Mr. Woodhouse was carefully attended to his own by Mr. Knightley and Mr. Weston. Isabella stepped in after her father. John Knightley, forgetting that he did not belong to their party, stepped in after his wife very naturally, so that Emma found, on being escorted and followed into the second carriage by Mr. Elton, that they were to have a tete-a-tete drive. Emma commented on the weather, but scarcely had she begun than she found her subject cut up, her hand seized, her attention demanded, and Mr. Elton actually making violent love to her. It really was so. Without scruple, without apology, without much apparent diffidence, Mr. Elton, the lover of Harriet, was professing himself her lover. She felt that half this folly must be drunkenness, and therefore could hope that it might belong only to the passing hour. Accordingly, with a mixture of the serious and the playful, which she hoped would best suit his state, she replied, "I am very much astonished, Mr. Elton. This to me! You forget yourself. You take me for your friend. Any message to Miss Smith I shall be happy to deliver, but no more of this to me, if you please." Miss Smith? Message to Miss Smith? What could she possibly mean? And he repeated her words with such assurance of accent, such boastful pretence of amazement, that she could not help replying with quickness, "Mr. Elton, this is the most extraordinary conduct. Command yourself enough to say no more, and I will endeavour to forget it." But Mr. Elton had only drunk wine enough to elevate his spirits, not at all to confuse his intellect. He perfectly knew his own meaning, and having slightly touched upon his respect for Miss Smith as Emma's friend, expressed his wonder that Miss Smith should be mentioned at all. Miss Smith, indeed! Oh, Miss Woodhouse, who can think of Miss Smith when Miss Woodhouse is near? I have thought only of you. I protest against having paid the smallest attention to anyone else. Miss Smith is a very good sort of girl, and I should be happy to see her respectably settled. I wish her extremely well, and no doubt there are men who might not object to... Everybody has their level, but as for myself, I need not so totally despair of an equal alliance as to be addressing myself to Miss Smith. No, madam, my visits to Hartfield have been for yourself only, and the encouragement I received." "Encouragement? I give you encouragement? Sir, you have been entirely mistaken in supposing it. I have seen you only as the admirer of my friend. In no other light could you have been more to me than a common acquaintance." He was too angry to say another word. Her manner was too decided to invite supplication, and in this state of swelling resentment and mutually deep mortification they had to continue together a few minutes longer. Without knowing when the carriage turned into Vicarage Lane or when it stopped, they found themselves all at once at the door to his house, and he was out before another syllable passed. Emma then felt it indispensable to wish him a good night. The compliment was just returned, coldly and proudly, and, under indescribable irritation of spirits, she was then conveyed to Hartfield. There she was welcomed with the utmost delight by her father, who had been trembling for the dangers of a solitary drive from Vicarage Lane. But her mind had never been in such perturbation, and it needed a very strong effort to appear attentive and cheerful till the usual hour of separating allowed her the relief of quiet reflection. Emma sat down to think and be miserable. It was a wretched business indeed. Such an overthrow of everything she had been wishing for, such a development of everything most unwelcome, such a blow for Harriet, that was the worst of all. Contrary to the usual course of things, Mr. Elton's wanting to pay his addresses to her had sunk him in her opinion. His professions and his proposals did him no service. She thought nothing of his attachment and was insulted by his hopes. But the first error and the worst lay at her door. It was foolish, it was wrong to take so active a part in bringing any two people together. It was adventuring too far, assuming too much, making light of what ought to be serious, a trick of what ought to be simple. She was quite concerned and ashamed, and resolved to do such things no more. Emma got up on the morrow more disposed for comfort than she had gone to bed, more ready to see alleviations of the evil before her, and to depend on getting tolerably out of it. The sight of a great deal of snow on the ground did her service, for anything was welcome that might justify her avoidance of Mr. Elton at present. Although it was Christmas Day, she could not go to church. Mr. Woodhouse would have been miserable had his daughter attempted it, and she was therefore safe from either exciting or receiving unpleasant and most unsuitable ideas. These days of confinement would have been remarkably comfortable, but there was still an evil hanging over her in the hour of explanation with Harriet which made it impossible for Emma to be ever perfectly at ease. Mr. and Mrs. John Knightley were not detained long at Hartfield by the snow. The evening of the very day on which they went brought a note from Mr. Elton to Mr. Woodhouse, a long, civil, ceremonious note to say, with Mr. Elton's best compliments, that he was proposing to leave Highbury the following morning on his way to Bath, where, in compliance with the pressing entreaties of some friends, he had engaged to spend a few weeks and very much regretted the impossibility he was under, from various circumstances of weather and business, of taking a personal leave of Mr. Woodhouse, of whose friendly civilities he should ever retain a grateful sense, and had Mr. Woodhouse any commands, he should be happy to attend to them. Emma was most agreeably surprised. Mr. Elton's absence just at this time was the very thing to be desired. She now resolved to keep Harriet no longer in the dark. She had reason to believe her nearly recovered from her cold, and it was desirable that she should have as much time as possible for getting the better of her other complaint before the gentleman's return. She went to Mrs. Goddard's accordingly the very next day to undergo the necessary penance of communication, and a severe one it was. Harriet bore the intelligence very well, blaming nobody, and in everything testifying such an ingenuousness of disposition and lowly opinion of herself as must appear with particular advantage at that moment to her friend. Harriet did not consider herself as having anything to complain of. The affection of such a man as Mr. Elton would have been too great a distinction. She never could have deserved him, and nobody but so partial and kind a friend as Miss Woodhouse would have thought it possible. Mr. Frank Churchill did not come to visit his father. When the time proposed drew near, Mrs. Weston's fears were justified in the arrival of a letter of excuse. For the present, he could not be spared, to his very great mortification and regret. Emma was the first to announce it to Mr. Knightley, and exclaimed at the conduct of the Churchills in keeping him away. "The Churchills are very likely in fault," said Mr. Knightley coolly, "but I dare say he might come if he would." "I do not know why you should say so. He wishes exceedingly to come, but his uncle and aunt will not spare him." "I cannot believe that he has not the power of coming if he made a point of it. It is too unlikely for me to believe it without proof." "How odd you are! What has Mr. Frank Churchill done to make you suppose him such an unnatural creature?" "I am not supposing him at all an unnatural creature in suspecting that he may have learnt to be above his connections and to care very little for anything but his own pleasure. If Frank Churchill had wanted to see his father, he would have contrived it between September and January." "That's easily said, and easily felt by you, who have always been your own master. You are the worst judge in the world, Mr. Knightley, of the difficulties of dependence. You do not know what it is to have tempers to manage." "It is not to be conceived that a man of 3 or 24 should not have liberty of mind or limb to that amount. A little while ago he was at Weymouth. This proves he can leave the Churchills." "Yes, sometimes he can." "And those times are whenever he thinks it worth his while, whenever there is any temptation of pleasure." "I will say no more about him," cried Emma. "You turn everything to evil. We are both prejudiced. You against, I for him, and we have no chance of agreeing till he is really here." "Prejudiced? I am not prejudiced." "But I am, very much, and without being at all ashamed of it. My love for Mr. and Mrs. Weston gives me a decided prejudice in his favour." "He is a person I never think of from one month's end to another," said Mr. Knightley. Emma and Harriet had been walking together one morning. They were just approaching the house where lived Mrs. and Miss Bates. Mrs. and Miss Bates loved to be called on, and Emma knew she was considered, by the very few who presumed ever to see imperfection in her, as rather negligent in that respect, and as not contributing what she ought to the stock of their scanty comforts. But now she made the sudden resolution of not passing their door without going in, observing, as she proposed it to Harriet, that, as well as she could calculate, they were by no means safe from a letter from Jane Fairfax, for old Mrs. Bates's conversation seldom omitted copious extracts from her granddaughter's most recent epistle. Jane Fairfax was an orphan, the only child of Mrs. Bates's youngest daughter. By birth she belonged to Highbury, and when at 3 years old, on losing her mother, she became the property, the charge, the consolation, the fondling of her grandmother and aunt, there had seemed every probability of her being permanently fixed there. But the compassionate feelings of a friend of her father gave a change to her destiny. This was Colonel Campbell, who had very highly regarded Jane's father as an excellent officer and most deserving young man, and furthermore had been indebted to him for such attentions during a severe camp fever as he believed had saved his life. When he returned to England from service abroad, he sought out the child and took notice of her. He was a married man, with only one child, a girl about Jane's age, and Jane became their guest, paying them long visits and growing a favourite with all. And before she was 9 years old, his daughter's great fondness for her and his own wish of being a real friend united to produce an offer from Colonel Campbell of undertaking the whole charge of her education. It was accepted, and from that period Jane had belonged to Colonel Campbell's family and had lived with them entirely, only visiting her grandmother from time to time when her studies, she was training to become a governess, allowed. Such a visit, Mrs. Bates informed them, was now due, and Emma learned that Highbury, instead of welcoming that perfect novelty which had been so long promised it, Mr. Frank Churchill, must put up for the present with Jane Fairfax, who could bring only the freshness of a 2 years' absence. Emma was sorry to have to pay civilities to a person she did not like through 3 long months. Why she did not like Jane Fairfax might be a difficult question to answer. Mr. Knightley had once told her it was because she saw in her the really accomplished young woman which she wanted to be thought herself. In truth, it was a dislike so little just that she never saw Jane Fairfax the first time after any considerable absence without feeling she had injured her, and this occasion was no exception. Jane arrived at Highbury after a 2 years' absence. Emma paid her a visit, and was most favourably impressed by the very appearance and manners which for those 2 whole years she had been depreciating. Jane Fairfax was very elegant, remarkably elegant. Her height was pretty, just such as almost anybody would think tall, and nobody could think very tall. Her figure particularly graceful, her size a most becoming medium, her eyes a deep grey with dark eyelashes and eyebrows. Emma sat, during her first visit, looking at Jane Fairfax with twofold complacency, the sense of pleasure and the sense of rendering justice, and was determining that she would dislike her no longer. Upon the whole, Emma left her with such softened, charitable feelings as made her look around in walking home and lament that Highbury afforded no young man worthy of giving her independence, nobody that she could wish to scheme about for her. These were charming feelings, but not lasting. Before she had committed herself by any public profession of eternal friendship for Jane Fairfax, or done more towards a recantation of past prejudices and errors than saying to Mr. Knightley, "She certainly is handsome. She is better than handsome," Jane had spent an evening at Hartfield with her grandmother and aunt, and everything was relapsing much into its usual state. Former provocations reappeared. Jane was, besides, which was the worst of all, so cold, so cautious. There was no getting at her real opinion. Wrapped up in a cloak of politeness, she seemed determined to hazard nothing. She was suspiciously reserved. For example, she and Mr. Frank Churchill had been at Weymouth at the same time. It was known that they were a little acquainted, but not a syllable of real information could Emma procure as to what he truly was. Was he handsome? She believed he was reckoned a very fine young man. Was he agreeable? He was generally thought so. Did he appear a sensible young man, a man of information? At a watering place, or in a common London acquaintance, it was difficult to decide on such points. Manners were all that could be safely judged. She believed everybody found his manners pleasing. Emma could not forgive her, but neither provocation nor resentment were discerned by Mr. Knightley, who had been of the party and had seen only proper attention and pleasing behaviour on each side. He was expressing, the next morning, being at Hartfield again on business with Mr. Woodhouse, his approbation of Miss Fairfax, not so openly as he might have done had her father been out of the room, but speaking plain enough to be very intelligible to Emma. He had been used to think her unjust to Jane, and now had great pleasure in complimenting her. Mr. Woodhouse, whose thoughts were on the Bateses, said, "It is a great pity that their circumstances should be so confined, a great pity indeed, and I have often wished, but it is so little one can venture to do. Small, trifling presents of anything uncommon, that sort of thing. Now we have killed a porker, and Emma thinks of sending them a loin or a leg. I think we'd better send the leg. Do you not think so, my dear?"
My dear Papa, I sent the whole hind quarter. I knew you would wish it. There will be the leg to be salted, you know, which is so very nice, and the loin to be dressed directly in any manner they like.
"That's right, my dear. Very right. I'd not thought of it before, but that was the best way. They must not over-salt the leg, and then if it is not over-salted, and if it is very thoroughly boiled and eaten very moderately of, with a boiled turnip and a little carrot or parsnip, I do not consider it unwholesome." "Emma," said Mr. Knightley presently, "I have a piece of news for you. You like news, and I heard an article on my way hither that I think will interest you." "News? Oh, yes, I always like news. What is it?" Before he could reply, the door was thrown open, and Miss Bates and Miss Fairfax walked into the room. Mr. Knightley soon saw that he had lost his moment, and that not another syllable of communication could rest with him. Miss Bates began.
"Oh, my dear sir, how are you this morning? My dear Miss Woodhouse, I come quite overpowered. Such a beautiful hind quarter of pork. You are too bountiful. Have you heard the news? Mr. Elton is going to be married."
Emma had not had even time to think of Mr. Elton, and she was so completely surprised that she could not avoid a little start and a blush. "There is my news. I thought it would interest you," said Mr. Knightley with a smile.
"Mr. Elton going to be married?" said Emma as soon as she could speak. "He will have everybody's wishes for his happiness."
"He is very young to settle," was Mr. Woodhouse's observation. "He had better not be in a hurry. He seemed to me very well off as he was. We were always glad to see him at Hartfield."
"A new neighbour for us all, Miss Woodhouse," said Miss Bates joyfully. "My mother is so pleased. She says she cannot bear to have the poor old vicarage without a mistress. This is great news indeed. Jane, you have never seen Mr. Elton. No wonder you have such a curiosity to see him."
Jane's curiosity did not appear of that absorbing nature as wholly to occupy her.
"Yes, he has been gone just 4 weeks," said Miss Bates. 4 weeks yesterday. A Miss Hawkins. Well, I had always fancied it would be some young lady hereabouts. Not that I ever... Mrs. Cole once whispered to me, but I immediately said, no, Mr. Elton is a most worthy young man, but... In short, I do not think I am particularly quick at those sort of discoveries. I do not pretend to it. What is before me, I see. At the same time, nobody could wonder if Mr. Elton should have aspired... Miss Woodhouse lets me chatter on so good-humouredly. She knows I would not offend for the world. Well, my dear Jane, I believe we must be running away. The weather does not look well, and Grandmamma will be uneasy. Oh, Mr. Knightley is coming too. Well, that is so very... I'm sure if Jane is tired, you'll be so kind as to give her your arm. Mr. Elton and Miss Hawkins. Good morning to you."
Human nature is so well disposed towards those who are in interesting situations that a young person who either marries or dies is sure of being kindly spoken of. A week had not passed since Miss Hawkins's name was first mentioned in Highbury before she was, by some means or other, discovered to have every recommendation of person and mind, to be handsome, elegant, highly accomplished, extremely rich, and perfectly amiable. And when Mr. Elton himself arrived to triumph in his happy prospects and circulate the fame of her merits, there was very little more for him to do than to tell her Christian name, Augusta, and say whose music she principally played. Mr. Elton returned a very happy man. He came back self-satisfied, eager and busy, caring nothing for Miss Emma Woodhouse and defying Miss Harriet Smith. unhappiness felt by Harriet on learning of Mr. Elton's engagement had been a little put aside by Elizabeth Martin's calling at Mrs. Goddard's a few days afterwards. Harriet had not been at home, but a note had been prepared and left for her, written in the very style to touch, a small mixture of reproach with a great deal of kindness, and till Mr. Elton himself appeared she had been much occupied by it, continually pondering over what could be done in return, and wishing to do more than she dared to confess. But Mr. Elton in person had driven away all such cares. While he stayed, the Martins were forgotten, and on the very morning of his setting off for Bath again, Emma, to dissipate some of the distress it occasioned, judged it best for Harriet to return Elizabeth Martin's visit. Small heart had Harriet for visiting. She went, however, and when they reached the farm and she was to be put down at the end of the broad, neat gravel walk which led between espalier apple trees to the front door, the sight of everything which had given her so much pleasure the autumn before was beginning to revive a little agitation, and when they parted, Emma observed her to be looking around with a sort of fearful curiosity, which determined her not to allow the visit to exceed the proposed quarter of an hour. The quarter of an hour brought her punctually to the white gate again, and Miss Smith, receiving her summons, was with her without delay. Harriet could not very soon give an intelligible account. She was feeling too much. But at last Emma collected from her enough to understand the sort of meeting and the sort of pain it was creating. She had seen only Mrs. Martin and the two girls. They had received her doubtingly, if not coolly, and nothing beyond the merest commonplace had been talked of almost all the time. Just at last, Mrs. Martin said she thought Miss Smith had grown. This brought on a more interesting subject and a warmer manner. In that very room, Harriet had been measured last September with her two friends. There were the pencil marks and memorandums on the wainscot by the window. Robert Martin had done it. They all seemed to remember the day, the hour, the occasion, to feel the same consciousness and regrets, to be ready to return to the same good understanding, and they were just growing again like themselves when the carriage reappeared. As they bowled along, Emma could not but picture it all. She would have given a great deal to have had the Martins in a higher rank of life, but as it was, how could she, Emma, have done otherwise? She could not repent. Presently the carriage stopped. She looked out. It was stopped by Mr. and Mrs. Weston, who were standing to speak to her. "Howdy do? Howdy do? We have been sitting with your father. Glad to see him so well. Frank comes tomorrow. I had a letter this morning. We see him tomorrow by dinner time, to a certainty. He is at Oxford today, and he comes for a whole fortnight. I knew it would be so. If he had come at Christmas, he could not have stayed 3 days. I was always glad he did not come at Christmas. Now we're going to have just the right weather for him. Fine, dry, settled weather. We shall enjoy him completely. Everything has turned out exactly as we could wish. I shall bring him over to Hartfield," he concluded. The following morning, Emma came down from her room, where she had been busy writing letters, as the clock in the hall struck 12. She opened the parlour door and saw two gentlemen sitting with her father, Mr. Weston and his son. They had been arrived only a few minutes, and Mr. Weston had scarcely finished his explanation of Frank's being before his time, and her father was yet in the midst of his very civil welcome and congratulations when she appeared to have her share of surprise, introduction, and pleasure. The Frank Churchill so long talked of, so high in interest, was actually before her. He was presented to her, and she did not think too much had been said in his praise. He was a very good-looking young man. She felt immediately that she should like him, and there was a well-bred ease of manner and a readiness to talk which convinced her that he came intending to be acquainted with her, and that acquainted they soon must be. Their subjects in general were such as belonged to an opening acquaintance. On his side were the inquiries: was she a horsewoman? Pleasant rides? Pleasant walks? Had they a large neighbourhood? Highbury, perhaps, afforded society enough? There were several very pretty houses in and about it. Balls? Had they balls? Was it a musical society? Finally, a reasonable visit paid, Mr. Weston began to move. He must be going. He had business at the Crown about his hay and a great many errands for Mrs. Weston at Ford's, but he need not hurry anybody else. His son, too well-bred to hear the hint, rose immediately also, saying, "As you are going farther on business, sir, I will take the opportunity of paying a visit which
must be paid some day or other, and therefore may as well be paid now. I have the honour of being acquainted with a neighbour of yours," turning to Emma, "a lady residing in or near Highbury, a family of the name of Fairfax. I shall have no difficulty, I suppose, in finding the house, though Fairfax, I believe, is not the proper name. I should rather say Barnes or Bates. Do you know any family of that name?" "To be sure we do," cried his father. "Mrs. Bates. We passed her house. I saw Miss Bates at the window. True, true, you are acquainted with Miss Fairfax. I remember you knew her at Weymouth, and a fine girl she is. Call upon her by all means."
"I have heard her speak of the acquaintance," said Emma. "She is a very elegant young woman." Frank Churchill agreed to it, but with so quiet a yes as inclined her almost to doubt his real concurrence. Emma's very good opinion of Frank Churchill was a little shaken the following day. Mr. and Mrs. Weston called and revealed that he was gone off to London merely to have his hair cut. A sudden freak seemed to have seized him at breakfast, and he had sent for a chaise and set off, intending to return for dinner, but with no more important view than appeared than having his hair cut. There was certainly no harm in his travelling 16 miles twice over on such an errand, but there was an air of foppery and nonsense in it which she could not approve. His father only called him a coxcomb and thought it a very good story, but that Mrs. Weston did not like it was clear enough by her passing it over as quickly as possible and making no other comment than that all young people would have their little whims. Mr. Weston, on his side, added a virtue to the account which must have some weight. He gave Emma to understand that Frank admired her extremely, thought her very beautiful and very charming, and with so much to be said for him altogether, she found she must not judge him harshly. Mr. and Mrs. Weston's visit this morning was in another respect particularly opportune. Something occurred while they were at Hartfield to make Emma want their advice, and, which was still more lucky, she wanted exactly the advice they gave. This was the occurrence. The Coles had been settled some years in Highbury, and were very good sort of people, friendly, liberal, and unpretending, but on the other hand they were of low origin, in trade, and only moderately genteel. On their first coming into the country, they had lived in proportion to their income, quietly, keeping little company, and that little unexpensively. But the last year or two had brought them a considerable increase of means. The business house in town had yielded greater profits, and fortune in general had smiled on them. With their wealth, their views increased. Their love of society and their new dining room prepared everybody for their keeping dinner company, and a few parties, chiefly among the single men, had already taken place. The regular and best families Emma could hardly suppose they would presume to invite. Nothing should tempt her to go if they did. The Coles were very respectable in their way, but they ought to be taught that it was not for them to arrange the terms on which the superior families would visit them. It now transpired that the Coles were having a party, and that their invitations had been extended to and accepted by all the best families in the neighbourhood, with one exception. No invitation had as yet been received by the Woodhouse family. This circumstance obliged Emma to reassess the situation, especially when she heard that Frank Churchill would be at the party and had been heard to lament Miss Woodhouse's absence from the guest list. It was the eventual arrival of this very invitation while the Westons were at Hartfield which made their presence so acceptable. For, though her first remark on reading it was that, of course, it must be declined, She so very soon proceeded to ask them what they advised her to do that their advice for her going was most prompt and successful. A large party, Emma amongst them, dined at the Coles' house. After dinner the numbers increased substantially as a multitude of gentlefolk came on from other dinner parties all over the neighbourhood. The very first of the early ones was Frank Churchill. In he walked, the first and the handsomest, and after paying his compliments en passant to Miss Bates and her niece, made his way directly to the opposite side of the circle, where sat Miss Woodhouse, and, till he could find a seat by her, would not sit at all. Emma divined what every lady present must be thinking. She was his object, and everybody must perceive it. She introduced him to her friend, Miss Harriet Smith, and, at convenient moments afterwards, heard what each thought of the other. He had never seen so lovely a face, and was delighted with her naivete, and she, only to be sure it was paying him too great a compliment, but she did think there were some looks a little like Mr. Elton. Emma restrained her indignation and only turned from her in silence. Mr. Churchill spoke so handsomely of Highbury altogether, thought it so abundant in agreeable families, that Emma began to feel she had been used to despise the place rather too much. "I have made a most wretched discovery," said he. "I have been here a week tomorrow, half my time. I never knew days fly so fast. A week tomorrow, and I have hardly begun to enjoy myself, but just got acquainted with Mrs. Weston and others. I hate the idea of leaving." "Perhaps you may now begin to regret that you spent one whole day out of so few having your hair cut," said Emma. "No," said he, smiling. "That is no subject of regret at all. I have no pleasure in seeing my friends unless I can believe myself fit to be seen." At the same moment, Mr. Cole approached to entreat Miss Woodhouse to do them the honour of trying the pianoforte. Frank Churchill followed Mr. Cole to add his very pressing entreaties, and as in every respect it suited Emma best to lead, she gave a very proper compliance. She knew the limitations of her own powers too well to attempt more than she could perform with credit. She wanted neither taste nor spirit in the little things which are generally acceptable, and could accompany her own voice well. One accompaniment to her song took her agreeably by surprise. A second part, slightly but correctly taken by Frank Churchill. They sang together once more, and Emma then resigned her place to Miss Fairfax, whose performance, both vocal and instrumental, she could never attempt to conceal from herself, was infinitely superior from her own. With mixed feelings, she seated herself at a little distance from the numbers round the instrument to listen. Frank Churchill sang again. They had sung together once or twice, it appeared, at Weymouth. Here ceased the concert part of the evening, for Miss Woodhouse and Miss Fairfax were the only young lady performers. But soon the proposal of dancing, originating nobody exactly knew where, was so effectually promoted by Mr. and Mrs. Cole that everything was rapidly cleared away to give proper space. Mrs. Weston, capital in her country dances, was seated at the piano and beginning an irresistible waltz, and Frank Churchill, coming up with most becoming gallantry to Emma, had secured her hand and led her to the top. She led off the dance with genuine spirit and enjoyment. The suddenness of it made it very delightful, and she found herself well matched in her partner. 2 dances, unfortunately, were all that could be allowed. It was growing late, and Miss Bates became anxious to get home on her mother's account. After some attempts, therefore, to be permitted to begin again, they were obliged to thank Mrs. Weston, look sorrowful, and have done. "Perhaps it is as well," said Frank Churchill, as he attended Emma to her carriage. "I must have asked Miss Fairfax, and her languid dancing would not have agreed with me, after yours." It may be possible to do without dancing entirely. Instances have been known of young people passing many, many months successively without being at any ball of any description, and no material injury accrues either to body or mind. But when a beginning is made, when the felicities of rapid motion have once been, though slightly, felt, it must be a very heavy set that does not ask for more. Frank Churchill had danced once at Highbury and longed to dance again. Before the middle of the next day he was at Hartfield. "Well, Miss Woodhouse," he almost immediately began, "your inclination for dancing has not been quite sated, I hope. I bring a proposal on the subject, a thought of my father's, which waits only for your approbation to be acted upon.
May I hope for the honour of your hand for the first 2 dances of a projected ball to be given at the Crown Inn?" "The Crown!" exclaimed Emma. "My father and Mrs. Weston are at the Crown at this moment," said Frank Churchill, "examining the capabilities of the house. I left them there and came on to Hartfield, impatient for your opinion and hoping you might be persuaded to join them and give your advice on the spot. I was desired to say so from both. They can do nothing satisfactorily without you." Emma was most happy to be called to such a council, and the 2 young people set off together without delay for the Crown. There were Mr. and Mrs. Weston, delighted to see her and receive her approbation. All the minor arrangements of table and chair, lights and music, tea and supper made themselves, or were left as mere trifles to be settled at any time. As for the more substantial problems, these were resolved by Miss Woodhouse with the minimum of fuss. Everybody invited was certain to come. Frank had already written to Enscombe to propose staying a few days beyond his fortnight, which could not possibly be refused, and a delightful dance it was to be. Alas! 2 days of joyful security were immediately followed by the overthrow of everything. A letter arrived from Mr. Churchill Senior to urge his nephew's instant return. Mrs. Churchill was unwell, and he must entreat Frank to set off for Enscombe without delay. The substance of this letter was forwarded to Emma in a note from Mrs. Weston instantly. Mrs. Weston added that Frank could only allow himself to hurry to Highbury after breakfast and take leave of the few friends there whom he could suppose to feel any interest in him, and that he might be expected at Hartfield very soon. This wretched note was the finale of Emma's breakfast. When once it had been read, there was no doing anything but lament and exclaim. The loss of the ball, the loss of the young man, and all that the young man might be feeling, it was too wretched. Such a delightful evening as it would have been, everybody so happy, and she and her partner the happiest. Emma was ready for her visitor some time before he appeared. His dejection was most evident. He sat really lost in thought for the first few minutes, and when rousing himself, it was only to say, "Of all horrid things, leave-taking is the worst." "But you will come again," said Emma. "This will not be your only visit." "Ah," shaking his head, "the uncertainty of when I may be able to return. I shall try for it with a zeal. It will be the object of all my thoughts and cares. If I can come again, we are still to have our ball. My father depends on it. Do not forget your engagement." Emma looked graciously. "Such a fortnight as it has been," he continued. "Every day more precious and more delightful than the day before. Every day making me less fit to bear any other place. Happy those who can remain at Highbury." A very friendly shake of the hand, a very earnest goodbye closed the speech, and the door had soon shut out Frank Churchill. Short had been the notice, short their meeting. He was gone, and Emma felt so sorry to part, and foresaw so great a loss to their little society from his absence as to begin to be afraid of being too sorry, and feeling it too much. Emma continued to entertain no doubt of her being in love. Her ideas only varied as to the how much. At first she thought it was a good deal, and afterwards but little. She had great pleasure in hearing Frank Churchill talked of, and for his sake greater pleasure than ever in seeing Mr. and Mrs. Weston. She was very often thinking of him, and quite impatient for a letter that she might know how he was, how were his spirits, how was his aunt, and what was the chance of his coming to Randalls again this spring. But, on the other hand, she could not admit herself to be unhappy. "I must not dwell upon it," said she. "I must not think of it." And, indeed, as Frank Churchill's arrival had succeeded Mr. Elton's engagement in the conversation of Highbury as the latest interest had entirely borne down the first, so now, upon Frank Churchill's disappearance, Mr. Elton's concerns were assuming the most irresistible form. His wedding day was named. He would soon be among them again. Mr. Elton and his bride was in everybody's mouth, and Frank Churchill was forgotten. Emma grew sick at the sound. She had had 3 weeks of happy exemption from Mr. Elton, and Harriet's mind, she had been willing to hope, had been lately gaining strength. Now poor Harriet was in a flutter of spirits which required all the reasonings and soothings and attentions of every kind that Emma could give. Emma felt she could not do too much for her, that Harriet had a right to all her ingenuity and all her patience. But it was heavy work. At last, Emma attacked her on another ground. Your allowing yourself to be so occupied and so unhappy about Mr. Elton's marrying Harriet is the strongest reproach you can make me. You could not give me a greater reproof for the mistake I fell into. It was all my doing, I know. I have not forgotten it, I assure you, and it will be a painful recollection to me forever. Do not imagine me in danger of forgetting it. This appeal to her affections did more than all the rest. The idea of wanting gratitude and consideration for Miss Woodhouse, whom she really loved extremely, made Harriet wretched.
You, who have been the best friend I ever had in my life, want gratitude to you. Nobody is equal to you. I care for nobody as I do for you. Oh, Miss Woodhouse, how ungrateful I have been!"
Such expressions, assisted as they were by everything that look and manner could do, made Emma feel that she had never loved Harriet so well, nor valued her affections so highly before. The new Mrs. Elton was first seen at church, but though devotion might be interrupted, curiosity could not be satisfied by a bride in a pew, and it must be left for the visits which were then to be paid to settle whether she were very pretty indeed, or only rather pretty, or not pretty at all. Emma made a point of Harriet's going with her, that the worst of the business might be gone through as soon as possible. The visit was, of course, short, and there was so much embarrassment and occupation of mind to shorten it that Emma would not allow herself entirely to form an opinion of the lady, and on no account to give one beyond the nothing-meaning terms of being elegantly dressed and very pleasing. She did not really like her. She would not be in a hurry to find fault, but she suspected that there was no elegance. "Well, Miss Woodhouse," said Harriet, when they had quitted the house and after waiting in vain for her friend to begin.
"Well, Miss Woodhouse," with a gentle sigh, "what do you think of her? Is she not very charming?"
There was a little hesitation in Emma's answer. "Oh, yes, very. A very pleasing young woman."
"I think her beautiful, quite beautiful."
"Very nicely dressed indeed. A remarkably elegant gown."
"I am not at all surprised that he should have fallen in love."
"Oh, no, there is nothing to surprise one at all. A pretty fortune, and she came in his way."
"I dare say," returned Harriet, sighing again, "I dare say she was very much attached to him."
"Perhaps, but it is not every man's fate to marry the woman who loves him best. Miss Hawkins perhaps wanted a home and thought this the best offer she was likely to have." Emma was not required by any subsequent discovery to retract her ill opinion of Mrs. Elton. Her manners and Mr. Elton's were unpleasant towards Harriet. They were sneering and negligent. By contrast, however, Mrs. Elton took a great fancy to Jane Fairfax from the first. About the third time of their meeting, Emma heard all Mrs. Elton's knight-errantry on the subject.
"Jane Fairfax is absolutely charming, Miss Woodhouse. I quite rave about Jane Fairfax. A sweet, interesting creature, so mild and ladylike, and with such talents. Oh, she is absolutely charming. You will laugh at my warmth, but upon my word I talk of nothing but Jane Fairfax."
Poor Jane Fairfax, thought Emma. You have not deserved this. It is a punishment beyond what you can have merited. The kindness and protection of Mrs. Elton. Jane Fairfax and Jane Fairfax. Heavens, let me not suppose that she dares go about Emma Woodhousing me. But upon my honour, there seem no limits to the licentiousness of that woman's tongue. But it is a mystery to me that Jane Fairfax should spend so much time with her. Upon her speaking thus before the few who knew her opinion of Mrs. Elton, Mrs. Weston ventured this apology for Jane. "We cannot suppose that she has any great enjoyment at the vicarage, my dear Emma, but it is better than being always at home. Her aunt is a good creature, but as a constant companion must be very tiresome." "You are right, Mrs. Weston," said Mr. Knightley warmly. "Miss Fairfax is as capable as any of us of forming a just opinion of Mrs. Elton. Could she have chosen with whom to associate, she would not have chosen her, but," with a reproachful smile at Emma, "she receives attentions from Mrs. Elton which nobody else pays her." Emma was struck by his warmth. "You think highly of her," she surmised. "I do," he readily conceded. "Well, Mrs. Weston," she said triumphantly when he left them, "what do you say to Mr. Knightley's being smitten by Jane Fairfax?" "My dear Emma, it would not surprise me at all." Emma decided to have a dinner at Hartfield for the Eltons. The persons to be invited required little thought. Besides the Eltons, it must be the Westons and Mr. Knightley, and she could now invite the very person whom she really wanted to make the 8th, Jane Fairfax. Since her last conversation with Mrs. Weston and Mr. Knightley, she was more conscience-stricken about Jane Fairfax than she had often been. Mr. Knightley's words dwelt with her. He had said that Jane Fairfax received attentions from Mrs. Elton which nobody else paid her.
"This is very true," said she, "at least as far as relates to me, which was all that was meant, and it is very shameful. Of the same age, and always knowing her, I ought to have been more her friend. She will never like me now. I have neglected her too long, but I will show her greater attention than I have done." Every invitation was successful. They were all disengaged and all happy. The preparatory interest of this dinner, however, was not yet over. First, Mr. Weston was called to town on the day in question. Consequently, he could not join the party till after dinner. Then a rather unlucky circumstance occurred. Isabella's 2 eldest children were engaged to pay their grandpapa and aunt a visit of some weeks in the spring, and their papa, Mr. John Knightley, proposed bringing them and staying 1 whole day at Hartfield, the very day of this party. Both father and daughter were disturbed by its happening so. Mr. Woodhouse considered 8 persons at dinner together as the utmost that his nerves could bear, and here would be a 9th, and Emma apprehended that it would be a 9th very much out of humour at not being able to come even to Hartfield for 48 hours without falling in with a dinner party. The day came. The party were punctually assembled, and Mr. John Knightley seemed early to devote himself to the business of being agreeable. Instead of drawing his brother off to a window while they waited for dinner, he was talking to Miss Fairfax. Mrs. Elton, as elegant as lace and pearls could make her, he looked at in silence, wanting only to observe enough for Isabella's information, but Miss Fairfax was an old acquaintance and a quiet girl, and he could talk to her. When the ladies returned to the drawing-room after dinner, Emma found it hardly possible to prevent their making 2 distinct parties. With so much perseverance in judging and behaving ill, did Mrs. Elton engross Jane Fairfax and slight herself. She and Mrs. Weston were obliged to be almost always either talking together or silent together. Mrs. Elton left them no choice. The whole party were but just reassembled in the drawing-room when Mr. Weston made his appearance among them. Having satisfied the inquiries of his wife as to his well-being, he gave her a letter. It was from Frank, and to herself. He had met with it on his way and had taken the liberty of opening it. "Read it, said he. "It will give you pleasure. Only a few lines. It'll not take you long. Read it to Emma." The 2 ladies looked over it together, and he sat smiling and talking to them the whole time in a voice very audible to everyone. "Well, he is coming, you see. Good news, I think. Well, what do you say to it? I always told you he'd be here again soon, did not I? Anne, my dear, did not I always tell you so? And you would not believe me. In town next week, you see, at the latest, I dare say." Finding himself close to Mrs. Elton and her attention disengaged, he necessarily began on the subject with her. "I hope I shall soon have the pleasure of introducing my son to you," he said. Mrs. Elton, very willing to suppose a particular compliment intended her by such a hope, smiled most graciously. "You have heard of a certain Frank Churchill, I presume," he continued, "and know him to be my son, though he does not bear my name."
"Oh, yes, and I shall be very happy in his acquaintance. I am sure Mr. Elton will lose no time in calling on him, and we shall both have great pleasure in seeing him at the vicarage."
"You are very obliging. Frank will be extremely happy, I'm sure. He's to be in town next week, if not sooner. We have notice of it in a letter today. This letter tells us, it is a short letter, written in a hurry merely to give us notice, it tells us that they're all coming up to town directly on Mrs. Churchill's account. She's not been well the whole winter and thinks Enscombe too cold for her, so they're all to move southward without loss of time." A very little quiet reflection was enough to satisfy Emma as to the nature of her agitation on hearing this news of Frank Churchill. She was soon convinced that it was not for herself she was feeling at all apprehensive or embarrassed. It was for him. Her own attachment had really subsided into a mere nothing. It was not worth thinking of, but if he were to be returning with the same warmth of sentiment which he had taken away, it would be very distressing. She did not mean to have her own affections entangled again, and it would be incumbent on her to avoid any encouragement of his. It was not very long, though rather longer than Mr. Weston had foreseen, before she had the power of forming some opinion of Frank Churchill's feelings. The family from Enscombe were not in town quite so soon as it had been imagined, but he was at Highbury very soon afterwards. He rode down for a couple of hours. He could not yet do more, but as he came from Randalls immediately to Hartfield, she could then exercise all her quick observation and speedily determine how he was influenced and how she must act. He was in high spirits, as ready to talk and laugh as ever, and seemed delighted to speak of his former visit and recur to old stories, and he was not without agitation. But it was a clear thing that he was less in love with her than he had been. Absence had produced this very desirable effect. It was not in his calmness that she read his comparative indifference. He was not calm. His spirits were evidently fluttered. There was restlessness about him. But what decided her belief on the subject was his staying only quarter of an hour and hurrying away to make other calls in Highbury. She had no doubt as to his being less in love, but neither his agitated spirits nor his hurrying away seemed like a perfect cure, and she was rather inclined to think it implied a dread of her returning power and a discreet resolution of not trusting himself with her long. This was the only visit from Frank Churchill in the course of 10 days. He was often hoping, intending to come, but was always prevented. His aunt could not bear to have him leave her, such was his own account. It soon appeared that London was not the place for Mrs. Churchill. She could not endure its noise. They were going to remove immediately to Richmond. Mrs. Churchill had been recommended to the medical skill of an eminent person there, and had otherwise a fancy for the place. Mr. Weston's happiness was indisputable. Now it would be really having Frank in their neighbourhood. What were 9 miles to a young man? An hour's ride. Richmond was the very distance for easy intercourse. One good thing was immediately brought to a certainty by this removal, the ball at the Crown. It had not been forgotten before, but it had been soon acknowledged vain to attempt to fix a day. Now, however, it was absolutely to be. No further misfortune occurred to prevent it. The day approached, the day arrived, and after a morning of some anxious watching, Frank Churchill, in all the certainty of his own self, reached Randalls before dinner, and everything was safe. Emma was smiling with enjoyment, delighted to see the respectable length of the set as it was forming for the next dance, and to feel that she had so many hours of unusual festivity before her. She was more disturbed by Mr. Knightley's not dancing than by anything else. There he was, among the standers-by, where he ought not to be. He ought to be dancing, not classing himself with the husbands and fathers and whist players who were pretending to feel an interest in the dance till their rubbers were made up, so young as he looked. He could not have appeared to greater advantage perhaps anywhere than where he had placed himself. His tall, firm, upright figure among the bulky forms and stooping shoulders of the elderly men was such as Emma felt must draw everybody's eyes, and, excepting her own partner, Mr. Frank Churchill, there was not one among the whole row of young men who could be compared with him. She wished he could love a ballroom better, and could like Frank Churchill better. He seemed often to be observing her. She must not flatter herself that he thought of her dancing, but if he were criticising her behaviour, she did not feel afraid. There was nothing like flirtation between her and her partner. They seemed more like cheerful, easy friends than lovers. That Frank Churchill thought less of her than he had done was indubitable. The ball proceeded pleasantly. The anxious cares, the incessant attentions of Mrs. Weston were not thrown away. Everybody seemed happy, and the praise of it being a delightful ball, which is seldom bestowed till after the ball has ceased to be, was repeatedly given in the very beginning of the existence of this one. In another moment, a happy sight caught Emma. Mr. Knightley leading Harriet Smith to the set. Never had she been more surprised, seldom more delighted than at that instant. She was all pleasure and gratitude, both for Harriet and herself, and longed to be thanking him, and though too distant for speech, her countenance said much as soon as she could catch his eye again. Supper was announced. The move began, and Miss Bates might be heard chattering to Miss Fairfax from that moment without interruption till her being seated at table and taking up her spoon. "Jane, Jane, my dear Jane, where are you? Here is your tippet. Mrs. Weston begs you to put on your tippet. She says she's afraid there'll be draughts in the passage. Yes, my dear, I ran home as I said I should to help Grandmamma to bed and got back again and nobody missed me. I set off without a word, just as I told you. Grandmamma was quite well. Had a charming evening with Mr. Woodhouse, a vast deal of chat and backgammon. Tea was made downstairs, biscuits and baked apples and wine before she came away. Amazing luck in some of her throws. And she inquired a great deal about you, how you were amused, and who were your partners. Well, here we are at the passage. 2 steps, Jane, take care of the 2 steps. Oh, no, there is but one. Well, I was persuaded there were 2. How very odd. I was convinced there were 2, and there is but one. I never saw anything equal to the comfort and style. Candles everywhere. Oh, do you recommend this side? Well, I'm sure Mr. Churchill only seems too good, but just as you please. Emma had no opportunity of speaking to Mr. Knightley till after supper, but when they were all in the ballroom again, her eyes invited him irresistibly to come to her and be thanked. They were interrupted by the bustle of Mr. Weston calling on everybody to begin dancing again. Come, Miss Woodhouse, Miss Otway, Miss Fairfax, what are you all doing? Come, Emma, set your companions the example. Everybody is lazy. Everybody is asleep. I am ready, said Emma, whenever I am wanted. Whom are you going to dance with? Asked Mr. Knightley. She hesitated a moment and then replied, With you, if you will ask me. Will you? Said he, offering his hand. Indeed I will. You have shown that you can dance, and you know we're not really so much brother and sister as to make it at all improper. Brother and sister? No, indeed. Her dance with Mr. Knightley gave Emma considerable pleasure. It was one of the agreeable recollections of the ball which she walked about the lawn the next morning to enjoy. She was not to see Frank Churchill this morning. He had told her that he could not allow himself the pleasure of stopping at Hartfield, as he was to be at home by the middle of the day. She did not regret it. She was just turning to the house with spirits freshened up when the great iron sweep gate opened and 2 persons entered whom she had never less expected to see together. Frank Churchill, with Harriet Smith leaning on his arm. Actually Harriet. A moment sufficed to convince her that something extraordinary had happened. Harriet looked white and frightened, and he was trying to cheer her. The iron gates and the front door were not 20 yards asunder. They were all 3 soon in the hall, and Harriet, immediately sinking into a chair, fainted away. A young lady who faints must be recovered. Questions must be answered and surprises explained. Such events are very interesting, but the suspense of them cannot last long. A few minutes made Emma acquainted with the whole. Miss Smith and Miss Bickerton, another parlour boarder at Mrs. Goddard's, who had also been at the ball, had walked out together and taken the Richmond Road. About half a mile beyond Highbury, they had suddenly perceived, at a small distance before them, on a broader patch of greensward by the side, a party of gipsies. A child on the watch came towards them to beg, and Miss Bickerton, excessively frightened, gave a great scream, and, calling on Harriet to follow her, ran up a steep bank, cleared a slight hedge at the top, and made the best of her way by a short cut back to Highbury. But poor Harriet was soon assailed by 6 children, headed by a stout woman and a great boy, all clamorous and impertinent in look. More and more frightened, she immediately promised them money, and taking out her purse, gave them a shilling, and begged them not to want more or to use her ill. She was then able to walk, though but slowly, and was moving away, but her terror and her purse were too tempting, and she was surrounded by the whole gang demanding more. In this state, Frank Churchill had found her, she trembling, they loud and insolent. By a most fortunate chance, his leaving Highbury had been delayed so as to bring him to her assistance at this critical moment, and it took him only a few seconds to extricate her from her distress. Such an adventure as this, a fine young man and a lovely young woman thrown together in such a way, could hardly fail of suggesting certain ideas to the coldest heart and the steadiest brain. It was a very extraordinary thing. Nothing of the sort had ever occurred before to any young ladies in the place within Emma's memory, and now it had happened to the very person, and at the very hour when the other very person was chancing to pass to rescue her. It certainly was very extraordinary, and knowing as she did the favourable state of mind of each at this period, it struck her the more. He was wishing to get the better of his attachment to herself, she just recovering from her mania for Mr. Elton. It seemed as if everything united to promise the most interesting consequences. In this state of schemes and hopes and connivance, June opened upon Hartfield. Mr. Knightley, who for some reason best known to himself had taken an early dislike to Frank Churchill, was only growing to dislike him more. He began to suspect him of some double-dealing in his pursuit of romance. While so many were devoting him to Emma, and Emma was making him over to Harriet, Mr. Knightley began to suspect him of some inclination to trifle with Jane Fairfax. He could not understand it, but there were symptoms of intelligence between them. "My dear Emma," said he one day when they were alone, "do you think you perfectly understand the degree of acquaintance between young Churchill and Miss Fairfax? Have you never at any time had reason to think he admired her, or that she admired him?" "Never, never!" she cried with a most open eagerness. "Never did such an idea occur to me, and how could it possibly come into your head?" "I have lately imagined that I saw symptoms of attachment between them, certain expressive looks which I did not believe meant to be public." "Oh, you amuse me excessively. I am delighted to find that you can vouchsafe to let your imagination wander, but it will not do. There is no admiration between them, I do assure you." The romance that mattered, in Emma's judgment, was that between Frank Churchill and Harriet Smith. Diplomatically, as always, Emma encouraged it and was delighted when Harriet made it abundantly clear in several conversations that she had long since given up pining for Mr. Elton. One day, soon afterwards, however, Emma's designs suffered a setback. In the course of some trivial chat, she merely said, "Well, Harriet, whenever you marry, I would advise you to do so-and-so." After a moment's silence, she heard Harriet say in a very serious tone, "I shall never marry." "Never marry? This is a new resolution." "It is one that I shall never change, however." "I hope it does not proceed from... I hope it is not in compliment to Mr. Elton." "Mr. Elton, indeed!" cried Harriet indignantly. "Oh, no, it derives from someone far superior to Mr. Elton." Emma knew well to whom she was referring. "Harriet, I will not affect to be in doubt of your meaning. Your resolution, or rather your expectation of never marrying, results from an idea that the person whom you might prefer would be too greatly your superior in station to think of you. Is it not so?" "Oh, Miss Woodhouse, believe me, I have not the presumption to suppose... Indeed, I am not so mad, but it is a pleasure to me to admire him at a distance." "I am determined against all interference," said Emma virtuously. "Henceforth I know nothing of the matter. Let no name ever pass our lips. He is your superior, no doubt, and there do seem to be objections and obstacles of a very serious nature. But yet, Harriet, more wonderful things have taken place. There have been matches of greater disparity." With these words, Emma breathed new life into the romance which found favour in her eyes, without for one moment interfering. The following day brought news from Richmond to throw everything else into the background. An express arrived at Randalls to announce the death of Mrs. Churchill. A sudden seizure of a different nature from anything foreboded by her general state had carried her off after a short struggle. The great Mrs. Churchill was no more. How it would affect Frank was a very early speculation with Emma. The character of Mrs. Churchill, the grief of her husband, her mind glanced over them both with awe and compassion, and then rested with lightened feelings on how Frank might be affected by the event. How benefited, how freed. She saw in a moment all the possible good. Now an attachment to Harriet Smith would have no opposition to encounter. Harriet behaved extremely well, with great self-command. Whatever she might feel of brighter hope, she betrayed nothing.
Short letters from Frank were received at Randalls, communicating all that was immediately important of their state and plans. Mr. Churchill was better than could be expected, and their first removal on the departure of the funeral for Yorkshire was to be the house of a very old friend in Windsor to whom Mr. Churchill had been promising a visit the last 10 years. At present, therefore, there was nothing to be done for Harriet. Good wishes for the future were all that could yet be possible on Emma's side. It was a more pressing concern to show attention to Jane Fairfax, whose prospects, if indeed there had been any basis for Mr. Knightley's conjecture, were closing, while Harriet's opened. Emma resolved to prevail on her to spend a day at Hartfield. A note was written to urge it. The invitation was refused, and by a verbal message. Miss Fairfax was not well enough to write. The following morning Emma wrote again, to say, in the most feeling language she could command, that she would call for her in the carriage at any hour that Jane would name, mentioning that she had Dr. Perry's decided opinion in favour of such exercise for his patients. The answer was only in this short note. Miss Fairfax's compliments and thanks, but she is quite unequal to any exercise. When Emma afterwards heard that Jane Fairfax had been seen wandering about the meadows at some distance from Highbury on the afternoon of the very day on which she had, under the plea of being unequal to any exercise, so peremptorily refused to go out with her in the carriage, she could have no doubt, putting everything together, that Jane was resolved to receive no kindness from her. She was sorry, very sorry. Her heart was grieved for a state which seemed but the more pitiable from this sort of irritation of spirits, inconsistency of action, and inequality of powers, and it mortified her that she was given so little credit for proper feeling, or esteemed so little worthy as a friend. But she had the consolation of knowing that her intentions were good, and of being able to say to herself that, could Mr. Knightley have been privy to all her attempts of assisting Jane Fairfax, he would not, on this occasion, have found anything to reprove. Mr. Knightley, as it happened, was staying with his brother in London. One morning, about 10 days after Mrs. Churchill's decease, Emma was called downstairs to Mr. Weston, who could not stay 5 minutes and wanted particularly to speak with her. He met her at the parlour door, and hardly asking her how she did in the natural key of his voice, sunk it immediately to say, unheard by her father, "Can you come to Randalls at any time this morning? Do, if it be possible. Mrs. Weston wants to see you. She must see you." "Is she unwell?" No, not at all, only a little agitated. She would have ordered the carriage and come to you, but she must see you alone. Can you come?" "Certainly, this moment, if you please. But what can be the matter? Is she really not ill?" "Depend upon me, but ask no more questions. You will know it all in time. The most unaccountable business, but hush, hush." They hurried away, and speedily arrived at Randalls. "Well, my dear," said he, as they entered the drawing-room, "I have brought her, and now I hope you will soon be better. I shall leave you together." Mrs. Weston was looking so ill, and had an air of so much perturbation, that Emma's uneasiness increased, and the moment they were alone she eagerly said, "What is it, my dear friend? Something of a very unpleasant nature, I feel, has occurred. Do let me know directly what it is." "Have you indeed no idea?" said Mrs. Weston in a trembling voice. "Cannot you, my dear Emma, cannot you form a guess as to what you are to hear? It relates to Mr. Frank Churchill, I guess." "You are right. It does relate to him, and I will tell you directly. He has been here this very morning on a most extraordinary errand. It is impossible to express our surprise. He came to speak to his father on a subject, to announce an attachment." She stopped to breathe. Emma thought first of herself, and then of Harriet. "More than an attachment, indeed," resumed Mrs. Weston. "An engagement. A positive engagement. What will you say, Emma? What will anybody say when it is known that Frank Churchill and Miss Jane Fairfax are engaged? Nay, that they have long been engaged." Emma even jumped with surprise, and horror-struck exclaimed, "Jane Fairfax? Good God, you are not serious. You do not mean it." "You may well be amazed," returned Mrs. Weston, "but it is even so. There has been a solemn engagement between them ever since October, formed at Weymouth and kept secret from everybody."
For some time, Emma could only exclaim and require confirmation, repeated confirmation, which Mrs. Weston repeatedly provided. "Well," said Emma at last, trying to recover herself, "this is a circumstance which I must think of at least half a day before I can at all comprehend it. What? Engaged to her all the winter before either of them came to Highbury? Engaged since October, secretly engaged. It has hurt me, Emma, very much. It has hurt his father equally. Some part of his conduct we cannot excuse." Emma pondered a moment and then replied, "I will not pretend not to understand you, and to give you all the relief in my power. Be assured that no such effect has followed his attentions to me as you are apprehensive of." Mrs. Weston looked up, afraid to believe, but Emma's countenance was as steady as her words. "That you may have less difficulty in believing this boast of my present perfect indifference," Emma continued, "I will further tell you that there was a period in the early part of our acquaintance when I did like him. Fortunately, however, it ceased. I have really for some time past cared nothing about him. You may believe me, Mrs. Weston. This is the simple truth." Mrs. Weston kissed her with tears of joy, and when she could find utterance assured her that this protestation had done her more good than anything else in the world could do. "Mr. Weston will be almost as much relieved as myself," said she. "On this point we have been wretched. It was our darling wish that you might be attached to each other, and we were persuaded that it was so. Imagine what we have been feeling on your account." "I have escaped," said Emma, "and that I should escape may be a matter of grateful wonder to you and myself. But this does not acquit him, Mrs. Weston, and I must say that I think him greatly to blame. What right had he to come among us with affection and faith engaged, and with manners so very disengaged? What right had he to endeavour to please, as he certainly did, to distinguish any one young woman with persevering attention, as he certainly did, while he really belonged to another? How could he tell what mischief he might be doing? How could he tell that he might not be making me in love with him? Very wrong indeed. Well," she continued, "I suppose we shall gradually grow reconciled to the idea, and I wish them very happy, but I shall always think of it a very abominable sort of proceeding. What has it been but a system of hypocrisy and deceit, espionage and treachery? Here we have been the whole winter and spring completely duped. Why did they do it? While old Mrs. Churchill lived, there could not have been a hope, a chance, a possibility of Frank marrying a girl with no fortune, no high position in society, and no prospects." Mrs. Weston paused, and a smile illuminated her features. "But scarcely are her remains at rest in the family vault than her husband is persuaded to act exactly opposite to what she would have required. What a blessing it is when undue influence does not survive the grave. He gave his consent with very little need for persuasion." At this moment, Mr. Weston appeared at the door. His wife gave him a look which invited him in. "Well," exclaimed Emma, "a very pretty trick you have been playing me, upon my word. This was a device, I suppose, to sport my curiosity and exercise my talent of guessing, but you really frightened me. I thought you had lost half your property at least, and here, instead of its being a matter of condolence, it turns out to be one of congratulation. I congratulate you, Mr. Weston, with all my heart on the prospect of having one of the most lovely and accomplished young women in England for your daughter." A glance or two between him and his wife convinced him that all was right as this speech proclaimed, and its happy effect on his spirits was immediate. By the time they had talked it all over together, and he had talked it all over again with Emma on their walk back to Hartfield, he was becoming perfectly reconciled, and not far from thinking it the very best thing that Frank could possibly have done. Harriet. Poor Harriet. Those were the words that reverberated in Emma's mind as she sat in expectation of a visit from her protégé. In them lay the tormenting ideas which Emma could not get rid of and which constituted the real misery of the business to her. Frank Churchill had behaved very ill by herself, very ill in many ways, but it was not so much his behaviour as her own which made her so angry with him. It was the scrape which he had drawn her into on Harriet's account that gave the deepest hue to his offence. Poor Harriet! To be a second time dupe of her misconceptions and flattery. Mr. Knightley had spoken prophetically when he once said, "Emma, you have been no friend to Harriet Smith." Her heart beat quick on hearing Harriet's footstep and voice. "Well, Miss Woodhouse," cried Harriet, coming eagerly into the room, "is not this the oddest news that ever was?" "What news do you mean?" "About Jane Fairfax. Did you ever hear anything so strange? Oh, you need not be afraid of owning it to me, for Mr. Weston has told me himself." "What did Mr. Weston tell you?" said Emma, still perplexed. "Oh, he told me all about it, that Jane Fairfax and Mr. Frank Churchill are to be married, and that they have been privately engaged to one another for this long while. How very odd!" It was, indeed, so odd. Harriet's behaviour was so extremely odd that Emma did not know how to understand it. "Had you any idea," cried Harriet, "of his being in love with her?" "Upon my word," said Emma, "I begin to doubt my having any such talent. Can you seriously ask me, Harriet, whether I imagined him attached to another woman at the very time I was, tacitly, if not openly, encouraging you to give way to your feelings for him? You may be very sure that if I had, I should have cautioned you accordingly." "Me?" cried Harriet, colouring and astonished. "Why should you caution me? You do not think I care about Mr. Frank Churchill?" "I am delighted to hear you speak so stoutly on the subject," replied Emma, smiling, "but you do not mean to deny that there was a time, and not very distant either, when you gave me reason to understand that you did care about him." "Him? Never, never! I should not have thought it possible that you could have misunderstood me. I know we agreed never to name him, but considering how infinitely superior he is to everybody else, I should not have thought it possible that I could be supposed to mean any other person. Mr. Frank Churchill, indeed! I do not know who would ever look at him in the company of the other." "Harriet," cried Emma, collecting herself resolutely in response to a dreadful suspicion, "let us understand each other now without the possibility of further mistake. Are you speaking of Mr. Knightley?" "To be sure I am. I never could have an idea of anybody else, and so I thought you knew. When we talked about him, it was clear as possible." "Not quite," returned Emma with forced calmness. "For all that you then said appeared to me to relate to a different person. I could almost assert that you had named Mr. Frank Churchill. I am sure the service Mr. Frank Churchill had rendered you in protecting you from the gipsies was spoken of." "Oh, Miss Woodhouse, how you do forget!" "My dear Harriet, I perfectly remember the substance of what I said on the occasion. I told you that I did not wonder at your attachment, that considering the service he had rendered you, it was extremely natural." "Oh, dear," cried Harriet, "now I recollect what you mean, but I was thinking of something very different at the time. It was not the gipsies, it was not Mr. Frank Churchill that I meant. No, I was thinking of a much more precious circumstance, of Mr. Knightley's coming and asking me to dance when Mr. Elton would not stand up with me, and when there was no other partner in the room." "Good God!" cried Emma. The rest of the day, the following night, were hardly enough for Emma's thoughts. Mr. Knightley and Harriet Smith. It was a union to distance every wonder of the kind. The attachment of Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax became commonplace, threadbare, stale in comparison, exciting no surprise, presenting no disparity, affording nothing to be said or thought. Mr. Knightley and Harriet Smith! Such an elevation on her side, such a debasement on his. It was horrible to Emma to think how it must sink him in the general opinion, to foresee the smiles, the sneers, the merriment it would prompt at his expense. How Harriet could ever have had the presumption to raise her thoughts to Mr. Knightley? Alas, was not that her own doing too? Who had been at pains to give Harriet notions of self-consequence but herself? If Harriet, from being humble, were grown vain, it was her doing too. Till now that she was threatened with its loss, Emma had never known how much of her happiness depended on being first with Mr. Knightley, first in interest and affection. Satisfied that it was so, and feeling it her due, she had enjoyed it without reflection, and only in the dread of being supplanted found how inexpressibly important it had been. Could she be secure of his never marrying at all, she believed she should be perfectly satisfied. Let him but continue the same Mr. Knightley to her and her father, the same Mr. Knightley to all the world. Marriage, in fact, would not do for her. It would be incompatible with what she owed to her father, and with what she felt for him. A cold, stormy rain set in, and nothing of summer appeared but in the trees and shrubs which the wind was despoiling and the length of the day, which only made such cruel sights the longer visible. The weather continued much the same all the following morning, and the same loneliness and the same melancholy seemed to reign at Hartfield. But in the afternoon it cleared. The sun appeared. It was summer again. With all the eagerness which such a transition gives, Emma resolved to be out of doors as soon as possible. There, with spirits freshened and thoughts a little relieved, she saw Mr. Knightley passing through the garden door and coming towards her. It was the first intimation of his being returned from London. There was time only for the quickest arrangement of mind. She must be collected and calm. In half a minute they were together. The howdy-doos were quiet and constrained on each side. They walked together. He was silent. She thought he was often looking at her and trying for a fuller view of her face than it suited her to give. And this belief produced another dread. Perhaps he wanted to speak to her of his attachment to Harriet. He might be watching for encouragement to begin. She did not, could not feel equal to lead the way to any such subject. He must do it all himself. Yet she could not bear this silence. With him it was most unnatural. She considered, resolved, and, trying to smile, began, "You have some news to hear now you are come back that will rather surprise you." "Have I?" said he quietly, and looking at her. "Of what nature?" "Oh, the best nature in the world. A wedding?" "If you mean Miss Fairfax and Frank Churchill, I have heard that already." "How is it possible?" "I had a few lines on parish business from Mr. Weston this morning, and he gave me a brief account of what had happened." "You probably have been less surprised than any of us, for you have had your suspicions. I have no doubt of their being happy together. I believe them to be very mutually and very sincerely attached." "He is a most fortunate man," returned Mr. Knightley with energy. "So early in life, at 23, a period when, if a man chooses a wife, he generally chooses ill. At 23 to have drawn such a prize. Frank Churchill is indeed the favourite of fortune. Everything turns out for his good." "You speak as if you envied him." "And I do envy him, Emma. In one respect, he is the object of my envy, for he has secured the hand of his beloved, whereas I—" As he paused, they seemed to be within a half-sentence of Harriet, and Emma's immediate feeling was to avert the subject, but not for the first time. Mr. Knightley surprised her. "Tell me," he said, "have I no chance of ever succeeding in securing—" He stopped in his earnestness to look the question, and the expression of his eyes overpowered her. "My dearest Emma, for dearest you will always be, whatever the event of this hour's conversation, my dearest, most beloved Emma, tell me at once. Say no if it is to be said." She could really say nothing. "You are silent," he cried with great animation. "Absolutely silent. At present I ask no more." Emma was almost ready to sink under the agitation of this moment. The dread of being awakened from the happiest of dreams was perhaps the most prominent of her feelings. "I cannot make speeches, Emma," he resumed. "If I loved you less, I might be able to talk about it more, but you know what I am. You hear nothing but truth from me. I have blamed you and lectured you, and you have borne it as no other woman in England would have borne it. Bear with the truths I would tell you now, dearest Emma, as well as you have borne with those that went before. God knows I have been a very indifferent lover, but you understand me." There, in the garden, he talked and she listened. Then she talked and he listened. When they returned to the house, she was his own Emma, by hand and word, and if he could have thought of Frank Churchill then, it would not have been with envy. It was a very great relief to Emma to find Harriet as desirous as herself to avoid a meeting. Their intercourse was painful enough by letter. How much worse had they been obliged to meet? Harriet expressed herself very much as might be supposed, without reproaches or apparent sense of ill usage, and yet Emma fancied there was a something of resentment, a something bordering on it in her style, which increased the desirableness of their being separate. It might only be her own consciousness, but it seemed as if only an angel could have been quite without resentment under such a stroke.
Emma's other cause for concern was her father. She told him that, if his consent and approbation could be obtained, she and Mr. Knightley meant to marry and would like to make their home with him, by which means Hartfield would receive the constant addition of that person's company whom she knew he loved, next to his daughters and Mrs. Weston, best in the world. Poor man! It was at first a considerable shock to him, and he tried earnestly to dissuade her from it. She was reminded more than once of her having always said she would never marry, and assured that it would be a great deal better for her to remain single. But it would not do. Emma hung about him affectionately, and smiled, and said it must be so. In the end, it was agreed upon as what was to be, and everybody by whom he was used to be guided assuring him that it would be for his happiness, he began to think that some time or other, in another year or two perhaps, it might not be so very bad if the marriage did take place. Time passed on. A few more tomorrows, and Isabella's family would be arriving at Hartfield, and Emma was thinking of it one morning when Mr. Knightley came in, and her thoughts were put by. After the first chat of pleasure, he was silent, and then, in a graver tone, began with, "I have something to tell you, Emma. Some news." "Good or bad?" said she, quickly, looking up into his face. "I do not know which it ought to be called." "Oh, good, I am sure. I see it in your countenance. You are trying not to smile." "I am afraid," said he, composing his features, "I am very much afraid, my dear Emma, that you will not smile when you hear it. Harriet Smith marries Robert Martin." Emma gave a start, which did not seem like being prepared, and her eyes, in eager gaze, said, "No, this is impossible." But her lips were closed. "It is so indeed," continued Mr. Knightley. "I have it from Robert Martin himself. He left me not half an hour ago." She was still looking at him with the most speaking amazement. "You like it, my Emma, as little as I feared. I wish our opinions were the same, but in time they will be. Time, you may be very sure, will make one or the other of us think differently, and in the meanwhile we need not talk much on the subject." "You mistake me, you quite mistake me," she replied, exerting herself. "It is not that such a circumstance would now make me unhappy, but I cannot believe it. It seems an impossibility. You cannot mean to say that Harriet Smith has accepted Robert Martin. You cannot mean that he has even proposed to her again, yet. You only mean he intends it." "I mean that he has done it," answered Mr. Knightley with smiling but determined decision, "and been accepted." He wanted her to look up and smile, and having now brought herself not to smile too broadly, she did, cheerfully answering, "You need not be at any pains to reconcile me to the match. I think Harriet is doing extremely well. I have been silent from surprise merely, excessive surprise, for I had reason to believe her very lately more determined against him, much more than she was before." "You ought to know your friend best," replied Mr. Knightley, "but I should say that she was a good-tempered, soft-hearted girl, not likely to be very, very determined against a man who told her he loved her." The joy, the gratitude, the exquisite delight of Emma's sensations may be imagined. The sole grievance and alloy thus removed in the prospect of Harriet's welfare, she was really in danger of becoming too happy for security. What had she to wish for? Nothing but to grow more worthy of him whose intentions and judgment had been ever so superior to her own. Nothing but that the lessons of her past folly might teach her humility and circumspection in future. It was, therefore, in the happiest spirits she set forward some time later with her father on a visit to the Westons. They arrived. Mrs. Weston was alone in the drawing-room, but hardly had they received the thanks for coming when a glimpse was caught through the blind of two figures passing near the window. "It is Frank and Miss Fairfax," said Mrs. Weston. "I was just going to tell you of our agreeable surprise in seeing him arrive this morning. He stays till tomorrow, and Miss Fairfax has been persuaded to spend the day with us. They are coming in, I hope." In half a minute they were in the room. Emma was extremely glad to see him, but there was a degree of confusion, a number of embarrassing recollections on each side. They met readily and smiling, but with a consciousness which at first allowed little to be said, and having all sat down again, there was for some time such a blank in the circle that Emma began to doubt whether the wish now indulged, which she had long felt, of seeing Frank Churchill once more, and of seeing him with Jane, would yield its proportion of pleasure. When Mr. Weston joined the party, however, there was no longer a want of subject or animation, or of courage and opportunity for Frank Churchill to draw near her and say, "I have to thank you, Miss Woodhouse, for a very kind, forgiving message in one of Mrs. Weston's letters. I hope time has not made you less willing to pardon. I hope you do not retract what you then said." "No, indeed," cried Emma, most happy to begin. "Not in the least. I am particularly glad to see and shake hands with you and to give you joy in person." He had a great deal to say in return, and very entertainingly, but on leaving Randalls and falling naturally into a comparison of the two men, she felt that, pleased as she had been to see Frank Churchill, and really regarding him as she did with friendship, she had never been more sensible of Mr. Knightley's high superiority of character. If Emma had still at intervals an anxious feeling for Harriet, it was not long that she had to suffer from the recurrence of any such uncertainty. She had no sooner an opportunity of being 1 hour alone with Harriet than she became perfectly satisfied, unaccountable as it was, that Robert Martin had thoroughly supplanted Mr. Knightley and was now forming all her views of happiness. The fact was, as Emma could now acknowledge, that Harriet had always liked Robert Martin, and that his continuing to love her had been irresistible. Before the end of September, Emma attended Harriet to church and saw her hand bestowed on Robert Martin with so complete a satisfaction as no remembrances, even connected with Mr. Elton as he stood before them, could impair. Indeed, at that time Emma herself scarcely saw Mr. Elton but as the clergyman whose blessing at the altar might next fall on herself. The month of October was the one fixed on, as far as they dared, by Emma and Mr. Knightley. They had determined that their marriage ought to be concluded while John and Isabella were still at Hartfield. John and Isabella and every other friend were agreed in approving it. But Mr. Woodhouse, how was Mr. Woodhouse to be induced to consent, he who had never yet alluded to their marriage but as a distant event? In this state of suspense they were befriended, not by any sudden illumination of Mr. Woodhouse's mind, or any wonderful change of his nervous system, but by the operation of the same system in another way. Mrs. Weston's poultry house was robbed one night of all her turkeys, evidently by the ingenuity of man. Other poultry yards in the neighbourhood also suffered. Pilfering was housebreaking to Mr. Woodhouse's fears. He was very uneasy, and but for the sense of his son-in-law's protection, would have been under wretched alarm every night. But Mr. John Knightley must be in London again by the end of the first week in November. Another son-in-law under his roof, the sooner the better, now became Mr. Woodhouse's constant prayer. The result of this was that, with a much more voluntary, cheerful consent than his daughter had ever presumed to hope for, she was able to fix her wedding day, and Mr. Elton was called on, within a month from the marriage of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Martin, to join the hands of Mr. Knightley and Miss Woodhouse. The wedding was very much like other weddings, where the parties have no taste for finery or parade, and Mrs. Elton, from the particulars detailed by her husband, thought it all extremely shabby and very inferior to her own. Very little white satin, very few lace veils, a most pitiful business. But, in spite of these deficiencies, the wishes, the hopes, the confidence, the predictions of the small band of true friends who witnessed the ceremony were fully answered in the perfect happiness of the union.